My name is Mark Levy. I will host today's webinar. I focus on product marketing here at OpsMx. Before we begin, a few housekeeping items. The session today is about 35 minutes long or so, a little over 30 minutes. We're recording the session. We will send the recording and slides to everybody. Ask any questions you want in the chat. We will answer as many as we can. And before we begin, we'd like to launch a poll, two questions we'd like to get from you guys. This will help us with our Q&A session as well as content in the future. We'd really appreciate it. And while you're doing the poll, what I'd like to do is introduce our speaker of today's webinar, Bob Boulay. Bob is our VP of products here at OpsMx. Bob has a 20-year career focused on solution engineering and product management around CI/CD, DevOps, and security. Bob, how are you doing today?
I am hanging in there, Mark. I want to take a moment to thank everyone for joining us today. I know everyone's time is valuable, and looking forward to a great session.
Great. Well, let's do that right now. The poll, I'll close the poll out, and let's dive in, Bob.
All right, great. So, guys, I think today, just a quick overview and agenda. I'm going to tell you a little bit about OpsMx as sort of the precursor, so you sort of have an understanding of who we are and sort of what we're up to. And then I think we'll dive right into, sort of the heart of the session. So I want to talk a little bit about what are guardrails, right, in the DevSecOps context. Let's start by defining what it is that we want to talk about. What do effective guardrails look like? So what are they? Like, once we've defined sort of what they are or sort of how they're used and sort of what the philosophical pieces around this are, let's get down to what does a good guardrail look like? What should it do? And why should you care, right? External forces in guardrails. I think, for a lot of us out there, when it comes to things like how we go about developing software or how we go about delivering software or the environments that we deliver software into, there are external forces that sort of make us put up guardrails as well, not just our own sort of internal SDLCs. And then, how can one use guardrails as we've defined them, right, to accelerate your software delivery process? And why does that matter, right? I think at the end of the day, we should be looking at these things as not only rules that we have to follow, but if properly implemented, ways that we can go about ensuring things like consistency and ultimately accelerating, if it's done correctly, our path from sort of the fingertips of the developer all the way out to where it can actually add value to the consumer of that particular software package. And then we'll take some time toward the end to actually look at some of these things in practice. Like, let's take a look at what some of these things look like in the real world, right? And so I'll bring you through some of that, and then we'll leave some time for questions. So that's sort of what I've got planned for the next 35 minutes or so. Now, in terms of OpsMx, I think our tagline says it all, right? Ship better software faster. OpsMx delivers software and services to secure and intelligently automate software delivery, right? So I think, we want to build on a security first type of architecture. So we help you go through that and look at your CI/CD process. We help you understand sort of how to make it more efficient. We provide you with the tools to make it more efficient. And ultimately, again, getting back to shipping better and more secure software in a faster manner. And below there are some just a spattering of customers that have engaged us to ultimately help them do just that. Again, I think, some examples of, sort of where folks have leveraged OpsMx, customers like Apple that are delivering, 24,000 pipelines and 1 million deployments a month. I think Cisco deploying over 7,000 applications and looking to make sure they're doing that securely. Customers like Western Union that are looking at us for compliance and automated approvals to make sure that their pipelines are meeting the rules and regulations, not only set out in external forces, but also through their own SDLC. And a couple of others like FedRAMP, or Cloudera that's looking to implement within a FedRAMP environment. And again, FedRAMP is a great example of where external forces bring guardrails into our environment. And then high trust for companies like ShareCare, high trust and automated auditing and reporting. Again, I think we're helping them go through that process of saying, hey, not only are we going to help you stay within those guardrails that are dictated by that external force, but also to be able to prove that you are as well. So again, just some examples of some customers that we've been able to help, just to put a little context around sort of who we are. Now, moving into sort of the presentation at hand, what are guardrails in the DevSecOps context? And I think guardrails in sort of a textbook definition here refer to a set of predefined rules, policies, and best practices that are put in place to guide and govern the development and deployment process, right? So that is something that, if you think about it, what we're trying to define here is, and if you look at the little picture that I put in there, guardrails are making sure that you don't, it's a bad day if you hit one of them, but nobody dies, right? And I think at the end of the day, that's what we're looking to do here, is we're looking to say, hey, what are the areas that we want our teams to operate within? What are those guidelines? And then how do we make sure that they're paying attention and those guidelines are being followed? The other piece of this is, in terms of ensuring that software development and delivery align with organizational goals and adhere to compliance and security requirements. And again, operating or maintaining operational stability are all, other areas where you're going to put guardrails in place. And the idea behind that is you want people to play within those lines, right? You want your dev teams, your QA teams, your operations teams to all operate within those lines. And the challenge here is laying those things out. You don't want to be hyper prescriptive. You don't want to, sort of force everyone down a single path, because that doesn't always work either. But I think, you want to make sure you leave enough room to make sure that these boundaries are very, very well defined. And I think, as you're going to see later in the presentation, as we get into some examples, some guardrails are more important in certain industries than others, or some guardrails are more important to individual software developers or companies that are developing software that are having it consumed by their customers. These things can vary depending on the industry and the business that you're in. And then lastly, I think guardrails serve as a proactive mechanism to prevent deviation from those desired practices, right? So again, when you're setting out to sort of help your team understand the lines that they need to be coloring within and the things that they need to be paying close attention to, I think those things and the items that go into those things need to really align with the overall goals of the business. And this is how we reach down into that and actually add those things in there to make sure that we're not, sort of drifting too far one way or the other. Or, and again, I think it's obviously, if you think about these guardrails and where the most quote unquote violations come from, are simple human error, right? It's human mistakes, but we need to be able to catch those things, right? We need to be able to catch them so that we don't pay a consequence down the road. That consequence could be discovery of this too late in the process, delays in shipping software, unhappy customers, right? So if we don't have these things set up and established, of course, we're always watchful of, sort of the nefarious pieces of this. But I think, in my experience, most of the time we find, coloring outside the lines is not malicious. It's simply a mistake. But nonetheless, it needs to be caught. And thus, the guardrails need to be put up and made sure that everyone understands what they are. Now, to put this in a little bit more context, I like to use this graphic because I think, this is the field of play, right? When we think about guardrails, or we think about, this is the road that we're traveling down, right? So development, delivery and deployment, and then ultimately into production, right? So on the development side, these guardrails are associated with things like, are you properly safeguarding your source code? Are your engineers following the laid out best practices as it relates to managing and using open source? Are you going down the path of inspecting your source code to look for good security practices? So all of these things are there sort of in that development, sort of lane. And then when you move over to your delivery and deployment, not only are we just checking to see if bad things are happening, like, hey, did somebody try and inject a bad artifact? But I think more importantly, we're making sure that all of the checks that are associated with these things are happening. Or, as an example, your build system. Is your build system up to snuff in terms of security patches? And are the webhooks and the other sort of network-based communications, is that stack making sure that that stack's working correctly? So when we look at this and we look at guardrails there, we're looking at safety and security, right? We did our best to go ahead and ultimately make sure we're coloring within the lines during the deployment process. Now, as we go through the build and then ultimately the delivery and deployment, we want to make sure that those best practices are being followed. This includes, by the way, things like vulnerability management, right? So when I think about this for a moment and I think, hey, I did a check back here, my developer, and he's got a good faith belief that the code that he checked in, is free of high and critical vulnerabilities, or whatever the case, whatever your guardrail is there, right? Does that continue to be the case as it moves through the deployment process? Again, that's a very dynamic piece of this. And then obviously in production, as we look at, sort of in a world of infrastructure as code, and in a world of, sort of cloud native and, defined applications through Helm charts, are the or even a Kubernetes manifest, are the parameters that are set inside of those things within the guardrails that we've laid out, right? So are we making sure that permissions are set correctly? Are we making sure that there are no obvious runtime problems or settings that could, ultimately jeopardize, or not even jeopardize from a security perspective, but, obviously put us out of compliance internally that might result in a higher AWS bill than we're looking for, right? Something along those lines. So again, I think it's an end-to-end, sort of road that we're traveling here, where those guardrails need to be put up. And that's the only reason I like to bring this slide up, is just to put that in context. Now, I want to talk a little bit about, sort of what effective guardrails look like, right? And I think, when we think about these things, we think about, boy, do we need to stop and look at these things before we deploy? Does this have to be a manual process? The answer there is no. I mean, any good set of guardrails requires being implemented through a set of automation, right? So we should be looking at, how do we take those rules that we want to make sure that we're enforcing, or at least that space that we're creating for people to operate within, and how do we go ahead and automate that process, right? How do we automate those checks, validate those things to make sure that they're indeed operating within those guidelines, right? And again, I think, think about this from the perspective of, simple mistakes. You don't have to get hacked, or you don't have to have, a bad actor in your midst to have this happen to you. It could simply be a mistake, right? And you want to make sure that there's some automation there. The other part is real-time feedback. I think guardrails need to provide that level of feedback, right, to the development and the operations teams. When a violation is detected, it should trigger some form of an alert. It should trigger something that allows the person not only to understand what the problem is and allow them to fix it, but that's also how that's a feedback loop that we want to make sure we close as well. Because again, if you assume the best, you're assuming that these guardrails were violated in error. And so how do we want to make sure that this doesn't continue to happen over and over again? That becomes that real-time feedback. And then, of course, guys, we have compliance and security, right? So we have guardrails that are going to play a crucial role in ensuring that the code and infrastructure changes comply with industry standards and regulations, right? That security piece becomes hyper important, when you think about this is in terms of just, again, implementing those best practices and those things that are set out by, again, external forces, which we're going to talk a little bit about later on, like high trust or FedRAMP. How do I make sure that I'm playing within those boundaries from a compliance and security perspective? You're also going to have, depending on the size of your organization, a compliance piece that's going to say, hey, we need to make sure that you're operating within these guidelines. And the only way to make sure that that continues to happen is to put up the guardrails around that. And again, this will make a little bit more sense when we look at some examples, but I think you guys understand sort of what I'm saying here is that, again, nobody wants to, or nobody can really be that prescriptive, but we want to make sure that we're operating within sort of that set of guidelines that allows the developer and the operations team to operate within a set of guidelines that is can be done in the best interest of the customer or the consumer of the software, but they have to pay particular attention to sort of those hard edges on the right and left of sort of what they're doing. Standardization and consistency. Well, again, I think guardrails that establish standards are some of the best that are out there, right? Making sure that we're all following and we're all consistent, right? The uniformity is crucial to scaling when it comes to software development and software deployment, as well as software consumption, quite frankly, right? And so to ensure code and features integrate smoothly with existing systems, and again, reducing potential for errors or inconsistencies, which are simply just going to slow everyone down, right? And let's remember that the idea behind this, the backdrop we're set behind here is we want to move faster, right? We don't want this to drag us down. We don't want to slow down. We want to move faster. And so having these guardrails configured the way I'm outlining here should prevent you from having to create drag on the process. Now, policy enforcement is something that's interesting as well, because policy gets into that area where we're now sort of making sure that the development practices and the deployment practices and the software construction meets with corporate and the company's sort of standards, right? And so, they may enforce a policy based on, sort of security, or based on, sort of the best practices around the business that you're in. But, again, the ability to any sort of guardrail implementation needs to allow for that set of policy enforcements as well, to make sure that everyone is thinking about things the same way and doing things the same way, and then ultimately getting to that bullet above, which is that consistency piece. And then, scaling the DevOps practices, again, I think this is what we're really talking about here, is these guardrails should serve to help us scale our DevOps practices while maintaining control and minimizing the risk, right? So doing all of that through sort of automation, but having these guardrails in place, again, it ensures and it prevents somebody from having to go back and say, let's stop what we're doing. Let's, do a complete audit as part of a deployment, or do a complete audit post-deployment. If these are configured correctly, we're going to be able to go ahead and ultimately, analyze these things in line, which I talk about a little bit later. But I think, when we think about guardrails and what makes a good guardrail, it has to pass that scale test as well. And so anything that doesn't help us scale our DevOps practices, it's not that we should ignore that thing. We should just be looking at a different way of doing it, or a different way of sort of enforcing it, or putting up that barrier or that edge. So that is sort of what I think effective guardrails look like in the real world. And I think when we start looking at things like what's going to drive us to put these things up, and in this case here, I've talked specifically about external forces, right? So if your company decides to do business with the federal government or government agencies, you may be faced with FedRAMP, right? If you decide to go down the path, if you're a SaaS provider and you decide to go down the path of SOC 2 Type 2, you might want to go ahead and make sure that you've got those things set up, or all the things that you're committing to in that SOC 2 Type 2 disclosure, so that when an auditor comes in, they can very easily see that you're practicing sort of what you preach in that document. And then we get into some of the hard ones, right? Like PCI and HIPAA, ISO 27001. These all come with certain things that you need to be doing, right? And they're going to audit those things, right? So in order to maintain these certifications, they're going to audit these things. And so we want to make sure that these things are being followed. We don't want to wait until an auditor comes in to then discover, oh, for the last year we've been doing it, a different way. We didn't intend to, but the auditor is not there to talk about your intention, right? They're there to talk about what you did. And so having those guardrails available and making sure that you're, again, coloring within the lines with hard edges on either side is really what's going to help you get through some of these processes, and make sure that you don't just make it through the certification process, but you're able to get through subsequent audits, right, from these organizations or these bodies, to ensure that you are, sort of practicing what you preach. I like to think of the guardrail process is essentially codifying your SDLC, right? So, and then taking and codifying some of the things that you're being asked to deliver on here on a regular basis here as well. And so I think this is really where these things sort of ensure compliance, or ensure that we're again painting within the lines, right, on an ongoing basis. And the utopia is, how do I do that without slowing my team down? And so this is really where I think, and again, these external forces can be something where, you just don't have a choice. They're not, sort of deterministic. You can't just show up and say, oh, here's my SDLC. They're going to say, great, here's a bunch of stuff we want to make sure you're doing in order to get our badge, right? And so we need to make sure that those things are happening. So this is another area here. And again, you'll see this as we walk through some examples of guardrails of where these types of things can come from. Now, guardrails and how they can help scale and accelerate, right? Now, again, I think the key here is really having those guardrails that sort of line up with some of the concepts we talked about earlier, right? So consistency, and sort of being able to make sure you stay safe, right? But I think, a lot of how they help you scale and how they help you accelerate is also tightly coupled to how you implement them, right? So, I don't want to lose track of the fact that one of the things that's key is automation here, right? So, because you guys might be thinking, oh, how do I do all this stuff without slowing down? And I think automation is the key. But anyway, so automated safety net, again, while the actual guardrails are human generated, so someone's going to sit down and say, or someone's already sat down and said, these are the things that we need to make sure that we're doing. The existence of automation leads to a faster process, and it allows you to, if you implement these things, it allows you to move faster without sacrificing safety, right? That's what guardrails are really doing for you. Real-time feedback, again, I think we talked about this earlier, but it's like, really making sure that when we do find a problem, 9 out of 10 times it's a mistake. And to close that feedback loop, to help someone understand, hey, we were expecting X, we got Y, the person can fix it, and then we can move forward, right? So I think being able to do that, especially in things like pre-production iterations, right? So, when you're moving code through the process from, say, test and dev to QA, and then from QA to staging, if these checks are implemented there as well, you're going to get to those things before the real pressure is on in terms of a production deployment. Inline automated review. And again, I think the inline automated review part is, again, another key piece here. When I think about this, I think about, how do I make sure all the systems that I'm using to do some of these checks have had an opportunity to chime in or had an opportunity to present results? And then how do I automate the evaluation of those results, right? So again, I think, if, in order to help us accelerate and create that speed without sacrificing safety, that inline automated review, if this is implemented correctly, is another area where it's going to help you move quicker. It's going to help you scale your process. And then I think the other part of this too is moving from a, sort of either one of two things, a very reactive sort of post-mortem audit model where you can't put the toothpaste back in the tube. So if you find a mistake, then all you can do at that point is own up to it and try not to let it happen again. Whereas I think the model we're after is a more proactive model. However, that proactive model, in order to keep us from having to slow down and look at all these things, has to be an exception handling model. So when I look at these things, I don't necessarily need to get a status report on every single thing that I've checked as part of my guardrails. What I need to know are, where are the problems, right? Surface the problems for me. Let me look at and deal with the problems. And then I can go back and say, all right, we fixed these, let's go again, right? So I'm not, in that case, I'm never breaking stride, right? I'm constantly moving forward. I'm handling exceptions, fixing problems, and then rolling that software to the next iteration. So again, I think that's another key part. And I think, this is more of an implementation detail than anything else, but it just goes to show you how a properly implemented guardrail system can help you scale and accelerate when it comes to, again, what we're all trying to do, right? Which is get software from the tips of the fingers of your developers all the way out to that edge where it starts generating value for your customers. Now, what I want to do is I want to have a look at some examples, right? And these are, sort of rather pedestrian examples, but I think they make a ton of sense and I think would be helpful in terms of adding context, right? So, one of the things that you can do, and you can see in this system here, where we've taken in and ultimately set up rules for our customers. This is a product called Deploy Shield, where for our customers, setting up sets of guardrails for them, right? So in this case here, we're looking at the OWASP CI/CD top 10 list. And so for each one of these things is a guardrail, right? Only 5% of the overall set of users must have admin access over code repository. This is what we're doing when we look at things like source code management, right? Or, and like I said, this doesn't have to be a stop ship, but we do want to make people aware that if this is out of compliance, right? Or things like, bot user must not be capable of merging any pull requests. Again, somebody might take a different approach to this and think differently about this, but from sort of a guardrail perspective, here's another thing. And again, I want you guys to think about this in the context of the typical development environment, right? Engineering groups are constantly spinning up new features or spinning up new products. There's new code being deployed. There's new repos being added. Again, fraught with sort of the human element of mistake or danger, right? And so being able to do that is, again, another key piece here in terms of looking at things like source code management. Or when we start getting into things like sys benchmarks, right? So looking at, like as an example here, container network interface provides various networking options. Over you should consult their documentation and restrict respective file permissions. Those permissions should be owned by root. So again, another area where it's a pretty obscure thing, but if you add all these things up, it could be relatively terrifying to have to think about all these things all at once. So we want to go ahead and actually add these frameworks to allow you to go ahead and actually do that. And it doesn't stop there. It also, when we look at things like the OpenSSF scorecard, again, you could pick and choose which of these would be appropriate for your organization. But again, these all represent sets of guardrails that we want to empower our users and our customers to ultimately be able to go ahead and implement. And these are all just examples of sort of how that can happen. It's the same thing with things like artifacts, right? So, if you think about how we think about the world, it's source, build, artifact, and deploy. We look at our artifacts, things like, is the artifact coming from an approved root repo, right? Seems simple enough, but if no one's looking, right, how do we guarantee that, right? So I think, these are the types of scenarios where when we look at our source code management, we, things like Git posture or secret scanning, we look at build, all the way through to deploy. And, we've got over 220 rules that we've built into deploy based on sort of how you can inspect infrastructure as code and other items that, are there to ultimately help you lock down that production environment. So again, think of all these things with these tags as sort of frameworks of guardrails, right? The other thing that you can do as a customer is you can create your own set of guardrails, right? So you can create your own. If there isn't something that's listed in either this tool or whatever tool that you happen to be using, we want to make sure that you have the opportunity to sort of create your own set of guardrails. And again, I think some of the other important things here are for you to be able to customize this for your environment. We understand that, and I think most vendors in this space understand, it's not a one size fits all situation. So you might want to, based on the business that you're in, or based on, the certain type of framework that you're trying to operate within, you may want to decide on a severity. You may want to decide on an action. In our case, we give you the ability to alert on it, right? So that you can take action straight away. But in the event that it slips all the way through to, say, a deployment, we also give you the ability to prevent a deployment from happening. So again, those guardrails are set up there to, again, keep people coloring within the lines, but also to make sure, and you need something like this that'll help you automate it and automate the enforcement of those guardrails to make sure that you're not stopping and watching and analyzing and then starting again. Let the tooling do that for you. So again, guys, that's sort of my walkthrough anyway of sort of what those guardrails should look like, how they should operate. I'm sure that this is nothing foreign to most people on the phone, but I think, at the end of the day, in terms of making sure that we're looking at these things correctly, and making sure that we're understanding what the importance is, right? We really want to make sure that we're building those things out. And again, I can't stress this enough because it's something that I haven't been in this business so long. All the bad things that I've seen happen in my career, at least, for organizations I've worked with, have just been simple mistakes, right? They haven't been anything nefarious. And that's not to say that badness isn't out there, right? You don't have to look any further than things like SolarWind type hacks and other types of scenarios where you wonder if these checks were in place, could that stuff have been prevented? Not sure, right? But I think at this point, given the wideness of the attack surface and the need to sort of stay and paint within the lines, we give ourselves the best opportunity to stay safe if we're actually implementing these types of scenarios. So, guys, that's sort of what I had for today. Hopefully, that was helpful, and helped you walk away with a little something that you can then take back to your everyday practice. I'll stop there now and open it up to any questions people might have.
Great. Thank you, Bob. And please enter your questions in the chat. It's interesting, Bob, while we're waiting for some questions, the general concept, right? We see this so much in sort of the industry, people talking about the balance between speed and sort of compliance, and I think what you're asserting is there's not a balance. You can go fast. In fact, guardrails, something like guardrails itself makes you go faster, because you don't have to worry about it, right? You just move as fast as you can and let the system sort of funnel your energy towards the target. So if you could, maybe comment on that. It's not really speed versus that. If we implement guardrails, we're going to go slower. No, it's actually you're going to go faster. Isn't that what you're saying?
That's exactly right. I think the analogy I like to make is, if you buy a new sports car, you're more likely, and you don't want to die, you're more likely to open it up on a road that has guardrails set up on it, and not just open cliffs. It's the same thing here, right? I think that people can take, sort of those ideas that they're always trying to do the right thing, but they can move quicker knowing that there's a system in place. So if there was a mistake made, it's just going to get caught. It's not going to turn into an incident. It's not going to result in either subpar or a deployment that's unsafe, right? Of course, security and compliance is everybody's job, right? But at the end of the day, when we think about this and we think about sort of what do we want our developers to be doing, that is converting ideas to value, right, through code that they write. And, of course, those best practices are going to be ingrained in them. But again, mistakes do happen. And we don't want people having to sit back and say, oh, I'm going to spend the next 3 days now making sure I didn't make any mistakes. I can push that code through knowing that it'll catch if I screwed something up, it'll catch it and I can fix it and move on. Right. So I think you're right. I think that feedback loop is tight and it allows people to move faster.
So development teams, in some ways, knowing that this is in place, can actually be more aggressive. Um, but it does raise the point, and you talked about it a little bit about what happens if there is a problem, and the collaboration between like development, security, and operations teams. So how, like, you get an event or a notification, it's imperative, I would think, or how do you, and maybe it ties with automation as well. How do you drive that into the workflow for mitigation? Right? It sort of
Yeah,
automates the whole gating process, right?
that's right. That's right. But I think the key here is getting fast feedback, right? So the idea behind this is, as your code is making its way through the process, you've cleared all of your gates, and then as it's moving through the process, if there are any problems, if there's a centralized system that's actually standing up these guardrails and enforcing these guardrails, the utopia here is that you get fast feedback and an opportunity to fix the problem very, very quickly, right? Without either the problem going undetected or it getting seen so late in the process that your deadline's blown, right? I can't, if I find out 2 hours before that there's a security issue, boy, that's a real problem, right? But if you're checking these guardrails at each stage along the way, and then in some cases in real time, or on a daily basis or an hourly basis, depending on how dynamic the data is that we're looking at, from say like a security vulnerability perspective, that's a great example of where it's good to know, right? It's good to know as early in the process as you can, so that you can again get that feedback to the relevant party, let them fix the problem, and then still hit your deadline, right? And again, I think the balance here is, and sort of what we're unlocking is the ability to crank up the velocity without diminishing, or without increasing the risk, I guess is the best way to phrase that.
Great. And so one question came through, one final question. I know we're extending a little bit, but so the guardrails imply that it's integrated, and you talked about, policies and automation and other components. What are the common challenges faced with integrating sort of the guardrails into the tool chain and the pipelines, large scale operations or organizations? How can OpsMx help there?
Well, I think the number one problem that the customers we talk to face is the siloed nature of the data that's used to evaluate those guardrails, right? So if you don't have something centralized that is evaluating this, right, then you get into that siloed, hey, did it pass this test over here for vulnerabilities? Did it pass this test over here for this? Who's looking at the security things that have been implemented in terms of our Git repositories? Where is all that data going, and who's checking it, right? So you might be collecting it, but if you don't have a centralized spot to take that set of guardrails that you've put in place and evaluate it against live data, it becomes a real challenge, right? Because then what you're forced to do is say, well, maybe as a last step before we deploy, I'm going to take my deployment checklist and go off and look at all these systems, right? That's just horrifying, because one, you're introducing yet another possibility for human error, and two, you're really slowing down the entire process at that point. So I think the key challenge that we see out there is, again, giving you the accumulation of all this information in a single spot, and that the rules around those guardrails being able to be evaluated in a single spot, so that you can just have one single source of truth there. I think that is something that we see every day in chatting with customers.
Well, great, Bob. Thank you again for the time and excellent content. I want to thank all the attendees that spent the time with us. And if you have any questions, please, further questions, go to opsmx.com. You can request a conversation with our experts and talk further about guardrails, compliance, and policy, and how OpsMx can help you solve your problems to ship faster code better. So with that, everybody, have a good day, and we'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.
Thanks all.